great pleasure to invite Professor Julia Buckingham to give the first talk. Julia is going to tell us about 90 years of scientific discovery and some of the struggles in drug classification to personalised medicine. Julia is an ex-president of the British Pharmacological Society, 2004 and 5. And Julia has had a fantastic career, was honoured with the CBE for services to biology and education. Julia has recently, or is about to finish as Vice-Chancellor at Brunel University. But Julia is going to be even busier becoming chair of the Institute of Cancer Research and so on, which is again a fantastic organisation and so on. So Julia, thank you very much for agreeing to give our first talk.
Well, thank you very much, Munir, and good morning, everybody. It really is a fantastic privilege to be giving this talk. It's really very exciting. And it's the first time I've stood in front of an audience for, gosh, nearly 2 years. It's quite an extraordinary feeling. But I think the one thing that, well, I'm sure the pandemic's taught us many things, but I think the one thing that will always stand out in my mind is just how much we all value human contact and how wonderful it is to be with friends and colleagues and just how much we've missed it. And we all, of course, took it totally for granted before. So, happy birthday to the BPS. 90 years, it sounds a very, very long time. But of course, on the grander scale of things, it's not really that long. But it has, though, been an absolutely extraordinary 90 years. And I think very few people would deny that the world is a very, very different place now from what it was like 90 years ago. And of course, science has played a massive part in that change. And the BPS and its members have been very, very important players in that change. Our collective endeavours over that time have delivered research which has advanced knowledge, and it's changed the way in which we can look after both humans and animals. We've also, of course, educated generations of students who've gone on to contribute to society in many, many different ways, from doctors and pharmacists and other healthcare professionals to research scientists, innovators, entrepreneurs and educators, to science communicators and journalists, and to individuals who contribute to science in so many other ways, for example, like our brilliant team at the BPS here. And of course, probably the many more who've studied pharmacology, but they've actually left science for very different career paths. But they've taken with them that rigorous analytical scientific thinking, and in their different ways, they've been incredibly powerful voices for science, and I don't think we should forget that. Where we haven't done so well is getting scientists, let alone pharmacologists, into government, as Kate Bingham so eloquently reminded us last week. And maybe we should put that on our to-do list for the next 90 years. But we do, of course, have a very distinguished member of the Society as the government's Chief Scientific Officer Advisor. And he is on the case, I think, in trying to get more scientists into the civil service, which would be great. So those of you who are still teaching students, do encourage your students, if they've decided they don't want to be scientists, to think there are careers out there. And of course, Patrick has been one of the leading figures advising the government during the last 2 years, and a very familiar face to everybody now, not just to us as pharmacologists. I doubt there are many people in this country who wouldn't recognise Patrick, and indeed admire what he's done. But also throughout those 90 years, the BPS has done so much to support all its members, and indeed to support pharmacology much more widely. For example, as Munir said, the very successful journals, which started here in the UK, but of course now are very, very highly respected internationally. They, of course, have also been important because they've generated lots of income for the society, and that's enabled us to do all the many things that we do. For example, the support we offer to our early career scientists, the outreach work, the educational services, the career development support, the work we do for the clinicians. It goes on and on and on. So I would like to think that, if I can get this to work, that those three pharmacologists, the same picture, Munir, but slightly different font, who established the society 90 years ago, and there were actually 20 of them, I believe, at that first meeting, I think they would be absolutely staggered if they could look at the BPS today and see everything that's been achieved. And I think, too, they would be very proud to see that the ethos that they so clearly had in spades of curiosity, innovation, creativity, combined, of course, with academic rigor and conviviality and collegiality, are so much of the ethos that we all associate with BPS today, and I think that's really fantastic. Now, 90 years ago, the scientific questions of the day were, of course, very different from the ones we're trying to deal with today. But I'm sure to those scientists they were no less challenging. And of course, many of the discoveries made back there form the foundations of work that we're still doing today. And I think the very fact that Gunn, Dale, and Dixon saw the need for society tells us that back in 1931, an awful lot was going on in the world of pharmacology. And when I was looking back at the literature, I was surprised to see that there was a lot of debate, and indeed hot air, I think might be a better description, about the classification of drugs. Should it be on the organ that they act on? Should it be by their chemical structure? Should it be their mechanism of action, their clinical use? And we could probably still have exactly the same conversations today. Some things never change. But at the same time, there was a lot of really groundbreaking work going on. For example, understanding peripheral neurotransmission, trying to combat infection, finding new ways to slow the release of insulin, which had just been introduced into the clinic. There was a lot of interest in screening natural products, isolating the active ingredients, creating synthetic versions, which could then be further modified. But the Pharmacopoeia in those days was a very, very slim document, and unfortunately I couldn't find a picture of it, but I did find a little bit out about it. If we fast forward 90 years, with the advantages of rigorous research and increased collaborations, both within and across disciplines, and indeed across the world, the power of genomics and other extraordinary technological advances, the Pharmacopoeia has without doubt changed out of all recognition. It's a massive tome, and we have many more treatments, of course. We're now able to target some diseases much more specifically and effectively than we could. So it is a remarkable story. If we look back at the post-war era through to the millennium, we saw the discovery of a range of so-called blockbuster drugs, which at the time of their discovery offered a step change in the way in which we treat disease and improve the quality of people's lives. For example, we saw the introduction and development of antibiotics, the introduction of corticosteroids as anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressant drugs, the development of antihypertensive drugs, from hexamethonium at the outset through to beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, A2 receptor blockers, and others that are still used in clinical medicine today. Neuromuscular blocking drugs, H2 receptor blockers, antidepressants, anxiolytics. The list goes on and on and on. And none of those remarkable new drugs would have been found without many years of understanding of the fundamental basic science which has elucidated the mechanisms of actions. And this goes from the submolecular level right the way through to the whole organism, sometimes yielding step changes in our way of thinking. For example, Sir John Vane, who of course won a Nobel Prize, did the, whoops, my slide has gone, it's all right. Something very strange is happening here. I've got somebody else's slides on there, but never mind. He did the critical studies that elucidated the mechanism of action of aspirin and transformed completely our understanding of inflammation, pain, and inflammatory disease. Now, nor would any of these developments have happened without the development of clinical pharmacology as a discipline and the growing rigor around the design and execution of clinical trials. And as early as the 1940s, this fellow again, Gadam, who was known for his passion of all things quantitative, he must have developed what was one of the earliest frameworks for clinical trials. And I love this quote in the preface. Medical men, brackets, and women are constantly being asked by manufacturers and others to try the effects of new drugs on patients. And it's therefore important that they should know something of the kind of evidence that justifies the trial of new drugs. This book tries to give them that knowledge. And that is the first edition of Gadam's Pharmacology, which, of course, I suspect many of us used as students in later editions. And there's a chapter of 5 pages in there, which I think is fantastic. So if you haven't read it, I would recommend that you do. Now, another important feature, of course, was the massive growth of the pharmaceutical industry here in the UK and elsewhere, with many pharmacologists in academia being attracted to the so-called dark side. And I never really understood why some of our academic colleagues had such an extraordinary disparaging view of pharma, but they did. But after all, when you look at it, pharma has done some absolutely amazing work, and it's supported and partnered academia in many, many ways. And of course, in recent years, we've seen great strides in sharing pre-competitive data. Now, as a young scientist, I always found it hugely refreshing that Jim Black, who of course was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work on beta blockers and H2 receptor antagonists, described his 6 years at ICI as some of the most exciting of his life, and he followed them by 15 years at SmithKline and French. So I think that's a pretty good recommendation for how good it must have been working in pharma. I remember the very first time I met Jim, and I was a PhD student at the Royal Free, so that's a very long time ago, and he came to give a talk about his work on H2 receptors, and he made an absolutely extraordinary impression on me. I knew absolutely nothing, literally nothing, about histamine or its receptors, but I was absolutely enthralled by his discussion of structure-activity relationships and the logic of his argument. But I remember too that he showed a huge interest in the work of us students, which was far removed from histamine. And looking back, I think that broad interest and those words of encouragement from a senior scientist to a beginner were a very, very important feature of the society. And it was very much a feature of the society, but of course in those days the BPS was much, much smaller. We had meetings, we all got to know each other. I think we used to have meetings once every 2 months, something like that, a lot of meetings. So we got to know each other very well. We didn't have parallel sessions or even posters, and senior members always attended everything, and they made a point of being there and asking questions and taking a real interest in the work that everybody was doing, even if it was way outside their field. Now, I don't think that ethos has changed, but of course it's much more difficult today. The society is much bigger, people are much more specialised, we have parallel sessions. There's nothing wrong with that, but I do think we've lost something about those senior members really thinking about how they can best support and mentor young people, and I think we've got some work to do there. But I digress. Returning to science, from the mid-1980s, we began to see the emergence of molecular biology and technology that changed the way that we do things. We saw the arrival of the biologicals and the growth of biotech, with a growing list of protein-based treatments, such as interferons, monoclonal antibodies, the beginning of gene therapy, and now, of course, mRNA-based vaccines. And, of course, the publication in Science and Nature in 2001, the first draft of the human genome, paved the way for precision and personalised medicines. And I think I'm probably right in saying, but some of my colleagues might want to correct me, but I think exploitation has been fastest in cancer because it's the disease where druggable pathogenic genetic mutations are very common. And I've very generously been given 2 or 3 slides from Paul Workman, who was the outgoing chief executive of ICR, just to illustrate some of these studies. Now, one of the first molecular targeted cancer drug to be approved was an EGRF tyrosine kinase inhibitor, which you can see here. And you can see its structure and you can see its X-ray crystallography. And Paul actually led the discovery work at AstraZeneca before he moved to ICR. And what it does, it's targeted to a mutation of the EGRF receptor. And if you look at the graph on the right, you can see how the survival rate is greater in those patients who've got that mutation treated with the drug, but not, if you look at the graph on the left, in patients who haven't got that mutation. Another nice example is the development of drugs which target the PI3 kinase AKT pathway that promotes cell growth and survival in response to extracellular signals. And early clinical trials showed that drugs that block this are particularly effective in patients with the AKT1 genome. And this compound that you can see here is now in phase 3 clinical trial for both breast cancer and prostatic cancer. And it has very good effects, you can see in the graph on the left, on a breast cancer xenograph. And if you look at the kinome tree, which is that sort of funny-looking thing with red blobs on it, you can see how it targets AKT 1, 2, and 3. And as technology advances with example, big data, AI, etc., so too does the opportunity for the development of highly targeted interventions. And there really are some amazing opportunities now for interdisciplinary teams to make a fantastic difference to the way in which we do science. Now, it's always nice to talk about the positive, but we shouldn't forget that research also sometimes brings disappointments. I don't think that any of us in this room has been through life without finding at least one and probably many of our hypotheses crushed completely when we've actually done the experiment and looked at the results. That's all part of science. And the disappointment when a promising line of investigation proves to be nothing more than a blind alley. I suspect we've all been there too. Or a new drug fails in clinical trial because it doesn't show any advantages over existing treatments. But far worse, of course, are when safety issues emerge. And I'm sure every one of us can remember the horrendous incidents at Northwick Park in 2006, when 6 volunteers suffered serious organ failure within a very short time of receiving a monoclonal antibody in a phase 1 clinical trial. And this, of course, led to the tightening of clinical trial regulations. And the COX-2 inhibitor that was withdrawn in 2004, just 5 years after it was introduced, amid concerns about an increased incidence of heart attacks and stroke, and disclosures that the manufacturer had withheld information from doctors and patients about the risk. And then in the days before we had recombinant proteins, the horrendous outcomes of people being treated with contaminated factor VIII extracted from human origins. And this, of course, is very much in the news at the moment. Now, it'd be easy to talk for a very long time about the extraordinary work of our members and the brilliant way in which the BPS team has supported them over this time. But there are many of you in this room who are far, far better qualified than me to do this. Rather, I'm going to turn to thinking about how our working environment has changed over the years, both organically and as a result of the political environment. Now, back in 1931, I'm going to think about our universities to start with. Back in 1931, most research, I think, took place in universities. The pharma industry was quite small, and of course, biotech hadn't been invented. But by today's standards, there were only a handful of universities. Oxford and Cambridge, St Andrews, and the big civics. Some, like Edinburgh and UCL, have been around for quite a long time. Others, like my alma mater, Sheffield, were formed by the city bringing 3 colleges together in the early 1900s. Of course, the population was much smaller in 1931, only about 46 million people of us in the UK, compared with just over 70 million today. And proportionately, only a tiny number of people went to university, around 10,000 a year. That's versus the hundreds of thousands who go to university today. And these students were drawn mainly from the public schools and the grammar schools, which in those days were partly fee-paying, with only about 50% of the places being offered to very talented children whose parents could not afford the fees. And sadly, many of those places were turned down because those same parents couldn't afford to pay for the uniform and the other extras that the schools demanded. Laboratory facilities at university were pretty basic too. None of the sophisticated kit that we're all used to today. Research groups were tiny, really just one man, and yes, it was mainly men, and perhaps a dog if you were lucky. And the opportunities for collaboration were very, very limited. But there was a will there, and the very fact that the BPS was formed shows how highly our scientists at the time valued communicating with one another. Politically, of course, it was an absolutely horrendous time. The UK economy was very weak, and it was becoming weaker because the traditional heavy industries like coal mining and shipbuilding, etc., were becoming increasingly uncompetitive. And the ramifications of the 1929 Wall Street crash spread right across the globe. Unemployment in the UK climbed to almost 3.5 million by 1932. And it was the time of hunger marches and the growth of extremist political parties. The British Union of Fascists, led by Oswald Mosley, and the Communist Party of Great Britain. But fortunately, neither achieved great mass. Most of the unemployed just simply wanted jobs. But in Germany, of course, that was not the case. In the 1930s, we saw the rise of the Nazi Party, and Hitler came to power in 1933 with the promise of making the German economy strong. And with that promise, of course, came the persecution of the Jews and the events that led to the Second World War. Now, many Jews fled Germany in those pre-war years, amongst them some people who were or were to become very distinguished scientists, including a number of very important contributors to pharmacology and the BPS. Our former colleagues, such as Gus Born, Edith Bulbring, William Feldberg, Hans Kosterlitz, people who some of us will remember very, very well. Now, as the war came to an end, the focus was on rebuilding our economy and society, and we had two major political interventions in the UK which had a huge impact on our social fabric. The first was Rab Butler's 1944 Education Act, and this aimed to remove those inequalities in secondary education that I was talking about a moment ago by providing free secondary education for everybody. Local authorities were required to reorganise their schools into grammar schools, secondary schools and technical schools, with entrance being determined by the 11+ exam. And the school leaving age was raised to 15. So while debates rage to this day about the pros and cons of selecting children on the basis of a cliff edge exam at the age of 11, at the time this was a massive advance. And of course the grammar schools became the principal feeders of our universities and hence the BPS for many years until the emergence of the comprehensive system in the 1960s. The second major intervention was, of course, the NHS, when the Health Secretary, Bevin, formally launched the NHS, and for the first time, healthcare in the UK was free to all. Now, over that period, of course, the NHS has become an essential partner of the BPS for BPS members, as we've striven to understand disease better, develop new and better treatments, and to train doctors, pharmacists, and increasingly other healthcare professionals for whom a knowledge of pharmacology, of course, is critical. Free access to healthcare and secondary education are things that we all take for granted. And whatever the faults with today's system, it really is salutary to think that when the BPS was formed, neither was freely available in our society. Now, after the Second World War, there was an enormous expansion in the demand for higher education, and many existing university colleges became universities. So Nottingham, Newcastle, Dundee, for example. And in the 1960s, several new universities were created. We had the 8 so-called plate glass universities, East Anglia, Warwick, Sussex. And then we had the technology universities, such as Bath and Aston, which were formed from former colleges of advanced technology. And with all this growth, of course, came the expansion of pharmacology. The 1960s also saw a major expansion of the polytechnics, which focused on vocational education and offers degrees awarded by the CNAA. Now, polytechnics were often regarded as ranking below universities, but the reality was they offered an excellent training with a strong practical element, often supported by a period of industry, something today that most of us see as increasingly important for all of our undergraduates. And without doubt, those polytechnics spawned some very, very good pharmacologists who've gone on to have extraordinarily distinguished careers in pharmacology. Then in 1992, the so-called binary divide between universities and polytechnics was abolished, and the polytechnics became universities, nearly doubling the number of universities in the UK. More change happened with the merger of most of London's medical schools. There were a lot, about 13, I think, into multi-faculty colleges, Imperial, UCL, King's and Queen Mary, and the progressive introduction of university fees, £1,000 a year to start with in 1998 in the Blair government, to £9,000 in 2012 under the coalition. And that led to the introduction of new private providers into the university. There are over 400, I think, registered providers with the Office of Students, our regulator. That's amazing. And a massive expansion of the sector, the opening up of the market. Universities could take as many students as they like, no longer were places regulated. And today, almost half our 18-year-olds go to university, almost 300,000 this year, and that is a 30-fold increase in the 90-year life of the BPS, with a less than doubling of the population. It's a quite extraordinary expansion. Now, universities today are also big businesses. Collectively, we contribute 110 billion to the UK economy every year. That's an awful lot of money. We have a really critical role in driving economic growth and social prosperity by developing the highly skilled workforce needed, and also, of course, through our research and innovation. And most of our universities are what we call anchor institutions in their local community. They're big employers, and they increasingly see themselves as a civic role, working with local partners and collaborating with each other to support the community in many different ways. Now, as part of all of that change, our universities, and indeed the BPS, has become much more international. And as science, of course, as we all know, it knows no borders, and nor should it. BPS members have been communicating and collaborating with colleagues from different parts of the world for as long as any of us can remember. At first, mainly by correspondence. It's quite sweet when you think about it, people writing letters to each other and sending them off airmail, but that's what we used to do. But as air travel opened up, of course, and the opportunities to attend conferences, to go on seminar tours to a range of different labs, or spend a sabbatical overseas, travel became the norm. And in the pre-pandemic era, we hopped on planes and trains in the way that we used to hop on buses, often going across the globe just for a couple of days. I wonder if we'll go back to that. And of course, with the BPS generating lots of money from our very successful journals that Rita is going to tell us about a bit later, that has helped many of our young scientists have the fantastic opportunity of going abroad and meeting colleagues and building their networks and learning about science elsewhere. And of course, the BPS itself has built very strong international partnerships through IUFAR, through engagement with specific countries like Australia, and of course with Europe. And we've also built up a very substantial international membership. I wonder if we really are still the British Pharmacological Society, because of our over 4,500 members, over 1,200 of them come from outside of the UK. I think that's quite remarkable. And of course, we've always welcomed our international colleagues here. We've enjoyed having people from many, many different parts of the world joining our teams as students, postdocs, and visiting scientists. Now, if we look at our universities today, we have 2.5 million students. It's amazing, isn't it, in our universities? But over 500,000 of those come from outside of the UK. And most of those come from outside of mainland Europe. And those numbers have grown absolutely enormously over the past 20 years. And we had the recent reintroduction of the post-study work visa, and that's provided another massive boost in the numbers of international students wanting to come and study in the UK. So if you look at our population, and these are data from last year, roughly 20% of our student population comes from outside the UK now. It's mainly postgraduate. And if you look at our publications, over half our publications are published with people from other parts of the world. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And of course, it's not just we've got this internationalisation. Going back to our role of our universities in driving the economy, every single part of the UK is better off because of international students. By, on average, £30 per person. That's a pretty amazing contribution to the economy. Now, many of you, of course, will remember that we went through a difficult time a few years ago when the UK seemed to be rather hostile to international students, and we had increasingly demanding visa requirements from UK VI and some very unfortunate public statements. Now, that has indeed all changed. I have to say the present government is very pro-internationalisation, and it's got a really strong international education strategy. And that encourages us not just to recruit more international students in the UK, they're very, very keen that we do that, but also that we take our education overseas. by setting up more online courses, setting up strategic partnerships overseas where we teach our programs overseas, or indeed setting up campuses in far-flung parts of the world. Naturally, of course, all at our own expense. The risk comes to the university, not to the government. But if you look at the numbers, you can see we're doing this really rather well. Over 600,000 students are studying for UK degrees outside of the UK. That's an awful lot of students. And just over 7% of our students are going abroad every year for some form of international experience. And we have a lot of international staff, of course. That's all very positive, but none of this internationalisation comes without risks. And they're not just financial risks. We're all very, very concerned about the issues of geopolitical issues, which seem to be growing and growing and growing. And indeed, Universities UK, which I've been heavily involved in, has been working with the security services over the last 2 or 3 years to develop guidelines to help institutions evaluate and manage the risks of making these investments. Now, no discussion about international activities would be complete without, dare I say it, a mention of Brexit. I'm sure we all agree that the EU gave us unparalleled opportunities to collaborate, build partnerships across Europe. And as those opportunities expanded when the Berlin Wall fell and as new countries joined that EU partnership. Not only could we travel freely and live and work in each other's countries without impediment, we were also able to welcome EU students here on the same term as our own students and provide our own students with the opportunity to study abroad through the Erasmus programme. So in 2018-19, we had 150,000 EU students here in the UK studying for degrees. And of course, we all benefited fantastically from EU research funding, Horizon, the ERC, Marie Curie, etc., with the UK winning substantially more in grants each year than our government invested. 1.5 billion in grants for an investment of 900,000 billion. Not bad. I don't think any of us would deny that that money was very welcome. But of course, I think to all of us, that scheme had far greater value. It enabled us to build strong teams of scientists across the EU to develop and share expertise, and it helped us build new networks and engage with companies across Europe, develop common approaches to regulation, to recognise each other's qualifications, etc., etc. None of that was there without the EU. And the outcome of the referendum was a shock, I'm sure, to many of us. It certainly was to me. I can still remember that morning. We'd made our case as universities for European partnerships and the value that they brought in the run-up to the referendum, and I don't think we were really prepared for the outcome, or the very negative press that we saw about our universities, where we were described as self-serving, etc. Nor, of course, were we prepared for the years of wrangling that have gone on since the referendum, over 5 years of it. Now, much of that is history now. EU students are now classed as international students. We no longer participate in Erasmus. Instead, we have a new global scheme, the Turing scheme, to encourage our students to study abroad. And we have to negotiate a new visa scheme for all of our EU students and staff, and similarly, we face visa challenges if we want to go and work in the EU. But the future of our research partnership with the EU is still up in the air. I think there's always been a very strong will on both sides for the UK to have full association. But as Theresa May so famously said, nothing is decided until everything's decided. And now we're seeing Horizon being used as a pawn in the discussions about Northern Ireland. And on top of that, there are rumblings about the cost and value for money of the new Horizon scheme. Horizon Europe set up in such a way that it's likely to cost a lot more than we put into it, than we get out of it. Many believe that despite that, it will still represent good value for money because of the broader benefits that those collaborations bring. But against that, there is growing evidence that UK scientists are submitting fewer applications for EU funding and that our success rate is falling. And worrying too, there's anecdotal data that the numbers of EU scientists wanting to come and work in the UK has fallen, and that hasn't gone unnoticed in the corridors of power. So while it was really great news in the CSR that the Chancellor has finally identified the $2 billion a year cost for full association, we're increasingly hearing of the need to develop a robust Plan B which will support collaborations within the EU and globally. And what that will look like, we don't know. And there's something about it in the Times today, so the conversation's still rumbling on. So I want to turn now, finally, to the challenges and opportunities for pharmacology. And I think every generation thinks that the generation before them had an easier time. And sometimes we don't appreciate what's good until someone comes and takes it away from us. And I think Horizon is a great example. How many of us moaned incessantly about the bureaucracy surrounding EU grants? But recently, I've hardly heard that mentioned. Looking back, there have been some really good times for pharmacology. The expansion of the sector after the war, the increasing number of students going to universities through the 60s and 70s, meant growth for pharmacology, with both the size and number of departments growing. We saw the emergence of clinical pharmacology as a discrete discipline and a clinical specialty, and the development of some very strong clinical pharmacology departments. For example, at the Hammersmith and at Liverpool, led for many years by two of our most distinguished colleagues, Sir Colin Dollery and Sir Alistair Breckenridge, of whom we're going to hear more later. And of course, our president is currently the head of pharmacology at Liverpool, carrying on the good tradition. By modern day standards, there seemed to be much more money in-house for both research and teaching in those so-called halcyon years. In teaching labs, for example, just imagine this. Every student worked on their own preparation, or at worst in pairs in the lab. For science students, practical classes took place 3 or 4 days a week. Departments provided core funding for research, and as a young academic, very often a dedicated research technician or scientific officer. It seems unthinkable by modern day standards that that's actually what it was like when I was a young academic. How many students today have that type of practical experience? And how many young academics have that level of in-house support for their research? But the economic problems of the 70s and early 80s hit the universities very hard as the unit of resource was progressively cut. And we became more and more dependent on external funding for our research, and the infrastructure around us began to show all the signs of wear and tear. And it was those tight budgetary restrictions at that time that led the then University Grants Committee, which most of you won't remember, but it was the predecessor of HEFSI, which was the predecessor of the OFS. That's when they introduced the first research assessment exercise, or RAE, in 1986. And that was to ensure that the allocation of research funding to individual universities was based on a quality measure. So for the first time ever, we saw our departments ranked as 5-star, 4-star, etc., based on their research outputs, and QR funding depended on that, as indeed it does today. Now, over the years, the RAE, or REF as it is now, has evolved, and it's been the cause, I think, of much heartache and debate. But few would disagree that overall it's been a good thing and instrumental in driving up the quality of UK research and cementing our world-leading position in the world. 1% of the population, 15% of research outputs, second only to the US in citations, and number 1 in field-weighted citations. It's a remarkable record, and it's interesting that many other countries have followed our example in introducing the RAE. But there have been downsides. As the REF grew in structure, teaching was seen by some as being less important, as the pressure on academics to get more funding and publish more high-quality papers grew. And I can remember, as quite a senior academic, being told by my then dean that he simply couldn't understand why I wasted my time teaching. There you go. But I think much more sadly, the pressure on academics has led to examples where there's been bullying, and I will return to that a little bit later. Pharmacology, too, went through something of an identity crisis back in the 1990s. Some of you will remember the publication of Tomorrow's Doctors in 1992, which championed a new approach to medical education where pharmacology scarcely featured and the science was diluted with a move to integrated systems-based teaching. At the same time, we saw the barriers between disciplines breaking down as we had developments in molecular biology, genomics, and technology. Pharmacology departments started to be subsumed into bigger cross-disciplinary departments, And we saw the emergence of more degrees in biomedical sciences, where the pharmacology element was not very visible. After the millennium, pharma in the UK also began to shrink, and we saw the closure of the UK bases of some very big players in the UK, Pfizer, Merck, for example, and GSK moving a very large chunk of their research to China. And we saw the growth of biosec. We also saw a shrinkage of clinical pharmacology, with fewer young doctors seeking to change in the specialty. But as so often happens, the pendulum began to swing back again. Newly qualified doctors started to report that they felt ill-prepared to prescribe drugs. Pharmacology found its way back into the medical curriculum, led by one of our dear colleagues, the late Mike Schachter, whose dedication to pharmacology teaching knew no end. Mike led the charge at the BPS in developing a prescribing exam, which is incorporated now into medical finals across the country. Pharmacology remains a very popular subject with undergraduates, and pharmacology graduates are highly employable, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And of course, drug discovery, drug development, and drug safety today is no less important than it ever has been, as COVID has so very clearly demonstrated. Pharmacology is here to stay. But I thought I would show you one very interesting set of data that came out last week, which is about intergeneral mobility. And pharmacology, as a discipline studied at university, is top of this league. I think this is quite remarkable. Now, what these people have done, this is a study done by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the Sutton Trust, and the Department for Education. And what they've looked at is people's career success rate measured, I don't like this index, but never mind, in terms of how much they earn, plotted against, along the bottom axis, access rate, looking at the percentage of students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, medicine, which you can see up there, does very well in earnings, as you might expect, but it does pretty poorly in attracting students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Pharmacology, on the other hand, does pretty well on earnings by comparison with other subjects, but also it does extraordinarily well in attracting students from disadvantaged backgrounds. So when this is all translated into a league table, there is pharmacology up there as number one. Isn't that great? I think that's nice. So finally, I want to turn to the subject of research culture, which is really a very hot topic at the moment, not for the right reasons. And much of it started, I think, with reports about bullying and harassment in labs and very widespread concerns about equality, diversity and inclusion, as well as issues around research ethics and integrity. And I would like to think, I must say, that the UK handles research ethics reasonably well. We have pretty clear regulations governing our approach to studies on animals and humans, genetics, etc., coupled with an openness and willingness to talk about what we're doing publicly. And it's not always been very easy. I'm sure many of you will remember the activities of the anti-vivisectionists 20 or so years ago, and the way in which some of our members were targeted, and how brave members like Clive Page were in talking publicly about the value of the work and the willingness with which our colleagues embrace the 3 Rs, reduction, replacement and refinement. Equally, we have a very strong code of practice for research integrity and a requirement that all our staff are properly trained and that we have processes in place to deal with research misconduct, which is right and proper. And of course, it also provides assurance to our regulators and to the general public. But have we gone far enough? Some would say no. And of course, BAYS and UKRI are currently looking at processes to strengthen the oversight of research integrity. Bullying and harassment are different issues, and of course they can impact on the mental health of people. I think few would disagree that we expect an awful lot of our researchers and indeed our academics. The pressure on them all the time to raise grant, publish in high-quality journals, deliver impact, support postdocs whose funding is coming to an end, and PhD students who are struggling to write up, while at the same time teaching and supporting students and coping with the ever-increasing demands of the students themselves and of all the bureaucratic things that we have to do. And for our clinical colleagues, of course, on top of that, clinical practice and the NHS. I don't think it's surprising that there's bad behaviour from time to time when people are under such extraordinary pressure. But we do need to think hard about how we spot it and how we deal with it effectively and how we try and actually reduce the amount of pressure that we put people on. We still too have an enormous amount to do with EDI. We've made some inroads on gender in the past 20 years or so with the advent of Athena Swan, and I think the BPS has done a great job in trying to support women. But as the chair of the panel that recently reviewed the Athena Swan Charter, I know only too well we have a very, very long way to go. And if ever there's a case for slashing bureaucracy and focusing on the action, that's it. But be that as it may, we're in a far worse place in ensuring equity for ethnic and other minority jobs. Many, probably most universities, have this at the forefront of their agenda. But it's going to take a long time, and I would suggest that as we embark on it, we look back and learn from some of the mistakes of Athena Swan. But what type of framework do we need to take these matters forward effectively with the minimum of bureaucracy? We have the Researcher Concordat, which draws integrity, behaviour, EDI, training, etc., all together under one umbrella to support the career development of our researchers. It was updated and substantially revised just before the pandemic to have more teeth, with obligations for 4 key sets of players: the funders, the institutions and their senior managers, the managers of researchers, by which we mean the PIs and the heads of department, not those people in the admin, and the researchers themselves. And it aims to bring us closer to a research environment and culture that genuinely celebrates differences, supports well-being and mental health, and nurtures the talent and career development of our researchers. We also have the government's R&D People and Culture Strategy, and that was published earlier this year under the leadership of the outgoing Minister for Science and Research. And we're expecting this to be followed up with lots of working groups and action plans in the coming months. While I don't want to minimise the importance of dealing with all of the issues around research culture, I am very worried we're in danger of developing an ever-growing web of complexity and bureaucracy. And I sometimes wonder if I'm alone in thinking it would be wonderful if we could have one single concordat or charter that pulled all these very complicated issues into a single framework which we could implement in a way that works for our own institutions, because every institution is different, to address their needs. And maybe this is what the bureaucracy review that the government's currently doing might lead to. Finally, I'm very conscious that my time is running out, but I just want to spend a few minutes thinking about what the future holds from the BPS and for its members as we emerge from the pandemic and prepare for the next 90 years. So, despite the strikes starting today in some of our universities, I think this whole sector should be incredibly proud of the way in which it's responded to the pandemic. And so too should pharma and biotech. We've seen research thrive with extraordinary advances in biomedicine and with pharmacology at the fore. The vaccines, and yes, I do count them as drugs, treatments for COVID, from repurposing good old dexamethasone to new antivirals and anti-COVID monoclonals, all in an absolutely extraordinarily short space of time. We've seen amazing collaboration between academia, industry, government, the regulators and funders to drive things forward at pace. And while I'm sure none of us wants to cut any corners, there must be a great deal of learning from this that we can take forward into the future. Alongside this, of course, we've all supported our students and made what I think heroic efforts to ensure that they were taught properly and supported in the very, very difficult circumstances that they were in, that we were in. And in our different ways, we've all done much to support our communities, whether it's through our students working in the NHS, volunteering, providing text facilities, and much, much more. As we emerge from COVID, we're seeing an extraordinary level of ambition emerging across the sector to support economic and social recovery. I have never, in my many years in academia, felt the sector so together in wanting to support the recovery, both through research and innovation and by addressing the skills gaps and inequalities in our society. No mean challenges. We have a government that seems to want to support research and innovation, even if that hallowed road to 2.4% seems to be getting much longer and bumpier than any of us ever thought it would be. And healthcare, in its broadest sense, is very, very high on the agenda. I don't think it's so rosy on the education front. We have threats of fee cuts, new regulatory measures, amongst other things in England, and not dissimilar pressures appearing in the devolved nations. But will pharmacology really suffer? I would be very, very surprised. STEM and other healthcare subjects are absolutely at the top of the government's priority. They want more students to study these subjects, not less. So I think we have a real opportunity. The ball is in our court to take those opportunities and make sure we thrive. So that's what my glass ball holds. And I think the BPS ought to be entering the next 90 years with great optimism and enthusiasm. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for being such great colleagues. And of course, happy birthday to the BPS.
Thank you very much, Julia, for taking us through those 90 years in a wonderful fashion and capturing many different areas and looking at some of the opportunities and challenges that we face. Are you happy to take any questions?
Yes, of course, yes.
Any questions? Maybe I can start, Julia. If you look at what's happened to departments of pharmacology, they've been subsumed into departments of biomedical sciences or clinical medicine, and to some extent we've lost our identity in universities. And you know, you've held leadership positions in universities and so on, so your perspective on that would be really interesting to hear.
I think the disciplines, I think it's true across the whole biosciences, I think the disciplines are there. They're just not identified in forms of departments, but I think we have groups of people who very definitely identify themselves as pharmacologists, but they work perhaps more effectively with other groups of people. But how we keep that identity actually in our universities, I don't know. I think actually it's probably easier now as a clinician than it is as a basic scientist, because I think clinical pharmacology has such an obvious place, even though every other specialty thinks they own the pharmacology of their bit. I think it's more difficult in basic science because I think we are seeing departments getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, so I think loss of identity is a big problem.
I think, yeah. And how we get young people in schools to understand that there really is a way through in pharmacology.
Yeah.
Maybe I think, you know, specialisation in the third year in biomedical sciences where there are courses that are very clearly labelled pharmacology, I think that's important. Yeah. Most of us, I suspect, who are scientists, identify most with what we did in our final year at university. I certainly did. The reason I studied endocrinology was because everybody in Sheffield was an endocrinologist. That's all I ever learnt about.
Any other questions, please? Ian.
I mean, just following up on that, I think there's actually an opportunity there because if you have a good pharmacology course in year one, you can actually attract students into the discipline who really wanted to be pharmacologists. And so we have, at King's, we've got lots of biomedical scientists, many of whom become pharmacologists just through us introducing them to the discipline. So there is an opportunity there. I'm not as pessimistic.
No, I'm not pessimistic, I was just asking a question.
I think, too, there's a greater public understanding now of pharmacology, and I think one thing the pandemic has done is to bring pharmacology absolutely to the fore. What do people want? They want drugs to treat COVID.
Amrita.
Hi, Julia. It's fantastic. What do you think it is about privilege and coming from underprivileged backgrounds that's attractive to those groups of individuals? The data is really exciting and it's great and we look good. But what do you think is why?
I honestly don't know, Amrita. And I think, it's the first time I've ever seen those data was last week. It just absolutely surprised me. I think maybe people, perhaps students, understand that pharmacology leads to a career, because I do think people from disadvantaged backgrounds, certainly my experience at Brunel, and we have a lot of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, we are very near the top of that league table, I'm proud to say. I think they come to university with much more thought about what their career is. And maybe we don't think enough when we're talking to students, when we're recruiting them into university, about what the career is. Pharmacology's got a path, it's got the pharmaceutical industry, so parents can understand that it goes somewhere. But it's a tough one to tackle.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the educationists in pharmacology spend a lot of time thinking about not just a career in pharmacology, but all of the sort of ancillary careers, connected careers that might be routes that individuals could take. And I think we do a lot to encourage that. Just to say that Queen Mary was the
You were
only
you were
Russell
number
group,
one. You were
and
number
we
one.
were right
You
at
were
the
number
top.
one. We were number 6. We were pretty pleased.
Congratulations on being close to
you
the top.
probably got more
but we were the
pharmacologists.
winners.
Okay, any more questions? If not, thank you very much,
Thank you.
Julia. Great talk. Thank you.